Welcome to the Betterment Lectures. My name is Dr. Dorian Miners, and if there is one thing I've learned as a brain scientist, it's that there's no instruction manual for this device in our head. But there are patterns of thinking, patterns of feeling, patterns of action, because that's what brains do. So let me teach you about them. One pattern, one podcast, and you see if it works for you. So I've done a couple of lectures now with this thread that runs through them, the way that pop psychology uses or rather misuses brain science. I've spoken about how people malign one of the most valuable biological technologies we have available to us, the human stress response, confusing it with trauma responses mostly, and how we should actually think about stress to make it useful. I've talked about where that bit of misinformation came from, how the amygdala isn't the fear center of the brain, but people use the amygdala as a shorthand for stress, hiding what's actually interesting about it. And I've talked about how people are now really getting into the idea of cognitive bias, construing it in a similar way, how these biases mess up your thinking, when really they're a pretty useful tool, so long, I guess, as you understand what they're trying to do. And I'll link all of those in the show notes, but I thought what I'd do today is try and pull on that thread more explicitly. I'm often struck by just how much of the pop psych advice you see for the average working person boils down to little more than something like, just cool the fuck out and you'll be better at stuff. And more to the point, I'm left wondering why we feel the need to over-engineer this stuff so egregiously, using brain science to justify our emotions, because these theories produce as much bad advice as good advice. So in this lecture, I want to show you 3 different flavors of this and see if we can work out what's so attractive about dressing up simple advice about how to be less stressed and anxious in these complicated brain sciencey clothes. And it's good timing too, because I'm planning an overhaul of the ancient positive psychology module that we teach at Sandhurst. And I think this is going to be the basis of it. So if positive psychology, getting your stress and anxiety under control, these sort of things speak to you, then maybe this is a good place to get started in updating your understanding. Though, of course, since I've mentioned Sandhurst, I should say that my opinions here are my own as an academic, as a clinician, not Sandhurst's, not the military's. It's just Dorian doing his little podcast. But that aside, if you're someone who pays any attention to wellness content or to self-help or business leadership material, you'll have encountered a bunch of different theories about how your brain and body sort of conspire to mess up your day. So I'm going to rattle off a few of them to try and see if I can capture you as a listener and show you that we're going to talk about some of these in more detail. So I've already mentioned amygdala hijack. I was talking about that earlier. There's also polyvagal theory, which is a theory that fits into this category. You might have heard of the lizard brain or the monkey brain or the reptilian brain. Again, something we'll speak to today. Some people talk about alpha and beta brain waves. You might have heard of positive intelligence with its saboteurs and sages. And finally, I guess, the chimp paradox or, its predecessor, Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, or thinking fast and thinking slow. All of these things are examples of what I would call over-engineering advice around how to calm down. They all superficially look like different theories about different things. So amygdala hijack is about your emotions taking over. Polyvagal theory is about your nervous system shutting you down. The lizard brain or the chimp paradox is about evolution leaving you with outdated hardware. All of these things look like different and sophisticated toolkits for understanding human behavior from different angles. And they're everywhere. I've seen them in consulting firms, at military conferences. I've had them raised in therapy rooms, obviously on infographics on Instagram and TikTok and the like, TED Talks, and even Psych 101 classes. They're very popular and they're very sciencey sounding, and they're all the same theory. They're just wildly over-engineered versions of the same advice, which is that if you're too stressed, you're not going to perform well. So today I want to show you what I mean, and maybe a better way of engaging with these kinds of ideas. Let's see how I do. Let's start with the old favourite, amygdala hijack. Now, this is this idea from the psychologist cum journo, Daniel Goleman's pop science book in the 90s on emotional intelligence. And he basically says that, when something stresses you out, your amygdala, this little almond-shaped bit of the brain, hijacks your more rational brain bits, the frontal lobes or whatever. And as a consequence, it makes you behave in silly ways. And I went through that in a previous lecture, and I'll link to that here. So I'm not going to rehash it much here, but suffice to say, with a bit of poetic license, it goes something like, once, we were running from tigers on the savannah and we needed to escape. So we had this fight or flight response to help us. But now we use the same brain to deal with being late to work. The amygdala takes over, it makes us freak out, and we're in the same sort of fight or flight state. A similarly over-engineered theory is polyvagal theory, which is this idea that we can break the autonomic nervous system, and that's all the nerves in the body that aren't the brain and the spinal cord, into 3 groups. One of these groups of nerves mobilizes you in response to stresses, so fight or flight. There's another group that immobilizes you when you're too threatened, so you freeze up, you shut down. And then there's this third sort of Goldilocks branch of the nervous system that lets you function normally. And just like in amygdala hijack, you want to do less of the other 2 branches and more of this Goldilocks branch. Now, I'm not going to get into this in more detail for a different reason than amygdala hijack. The Wikipedia page itself is pretty clear about how unfavorably it's been received as an academic theory, and I don't want to accidentally spread it by giving it more airtime. It's already popular enough. What puzzles me about this theory and about amygdala hijack is that they're both really complicated. This one, polyvagal theory, even more complicated than amygdala hijack, and they both say the same thing. Too much stress puts you into this sort of super stressed fight or flight mode. And I never really understood why people would want a theory that gets into the nitty-gritty details of neuroanatomy, of dorsal and ventral distinctions in the vagus nerve, and this sort of endless detail on nucleus bundles, all this terminology, just to tell them that if they're too stressed, it'll be unpleasant, but if they're normally stressed, they'll be fine. And I mean, speaking of the vagus nerve that came out, I think, of polyvagal theory, although I might be wrong about that, but you have people now online doing breath work and ear massage and cold plunges, all in the name of toning their vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve, from a brain scientist perspective, is just the biggest nerve in the body. It is, you'd hope, related to the nervous system as a result. And so the stuff people do to stimulate it, the breathing, the groundwork, the cold exposure, all of this is just stress reduction that shows up in the vagus nerve because it's the biggest nerve, it's easiest to measure. So it works, but it works because stress reduction works, not because you're doing something magical to a particular nerve. So we have to ask ourselves a question, which is, what's going on? Why overcomplicate the stress response? Why don't we just do what I like to do and use the stress curve, which says the same thing in simpler language? Too much stress makes your body respond like you're being too stressed. Less stress makes you respond more normally. As I've been lecturing and consulting on particularly this concept for a while, I've sort of come to a conclusion here. And the conclusion is that these theories all make it clear that the negative outcomes of being too stressed aren't because we're doing something wrong, but because our bodies are doing something that we can't control. And that, I guess, is a pretty interesting insight, that it's not your fault per se. It's your amygdala or your vagal tone. It's this mechanism inside you. And when you do this kind of cognitive work, you can name it, you can fight it. It's not you, it's some sort of enemy. The part of you that shuts down or gets too angry when you're super stressed doesn't represent you. I think that hearing this is a pretty liberating sort of thing. So that's one aspect. But another aspect is this sociology of the interesting that I like to talk about a lot, and I'll link to that in the show notes. But it's the idea that a theory doesn't get popular because it's true, but because it violates your weakly held beliefs. Stress isn't characteristic of me, it's because of a misfiring dorsal vagal complex, is exactly the kind of thing that you'd want to tell people down the pub. It would surprise them. And all of that seems fine, I guess, if it makes sense to people, but I think it has an important cost. And that cost is that fight or flight, or freeze or fawn, all these Fs originally described something quite specific. It's called hypervigilance. And I'll link to an article that talks about that in more detail. But this is fundamentally a severe physiological response to genuine threats, to life or death kinds of threats. And when we steal that term for everyday stress, we run the risk of alienating or marginalizing people who actually experience hypervigilance. People with trauma, people with PTSD, people with acute stress. And it might not surprise you to learn that these theories are very popular in and often originating in exactly these communities. So trauma circles or self-help circles where the incidence of actual hypervigilance is higher. And it doesn't really seem ideal to me to be encouraging people who are having life or death physical reactions to trivial daily stresses to just sort of push through and carry on. I feel like these people should be encouraged to seek support. And more importantly, stress isn't really an enemy. And again, I covered this in the very first episode of this lecture series, but the sympathetico-adrenal response recruits resources to tackle the task at hand. So as stress goes up, your performance at doing something goes up. And it's only really for people without these more substantial stress responses, when stress becomes too great or when it lasts too long, that it starts to produce these really negative outcomes. And that's because emotions generally are motivators. So we don't act unless there's an emotive reason to act, at least not as far as anybody can tell. So when we demonize our more stressful emotions, it doesn't exactly seem to me like it's going to get us very far. And that is the first flavor of these kinds of theories, this sort of overcomplication of fight or flight, overcomplicating our stress response, really. I think it's liberating, perhaps, but not really that sweet for actually dealing with it. So we probably want to start thinking a little differently about stress. That's the first thing that I would suggest, and we'll come back to that idea. But let's move on now to another flavor that's embedded within these theories. Now, we talked about polyvagal theory before, and it actually bridges us nicely to the second flavor embedded within this class of theories, because it claims that its three nervous system branches have this evolutionary order. So remember, polyvagal theory talks about a nerve complex that, immobilizes us in response to stress, one that mobilizes us in response to stress, and this sort of Goldilocks branch as the newest feature and the one that we should try and get after. Now, according to polyvagal theory, the immobilizing one is oldest, followed by the mobilizing one, and this Goldilocks branch of the nervous system is the newest feature of the mammalian nervous system. And obviously, the older branches are a bit shit, the logic sort of goes, so we should try and tap into that human new one, because why would we rely on the worse, evolutionarily more ancient ones? Now, this old equals bad trope is sort of embedded in a lot of these. The main offender is the lizard brain, which comes from the now discredited 1960s Triune brain model, and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes, but it fundamentally views the brain as an onion. So you have this very old reptilian brain at the core, a newer, early mammalian brain around it, and then this shiny new neo-mammalian complex on top. Now, the original author was a bit more thoughtful about this than modern takes. He just suggested that older structures handled instinct, middle ones handled emotion, and the newer ones handled higher order thought that we associate with humans. And MacLean, the author, wasn't really interested in making one seem worse than the others. I suspect he thought that all were necessary. But psychology, in the popular sense, ran with it and came up with the idea that basically we should set aside our lizard impulses, get out of our monkey brain, and evolve past our outdated wetware. Now, the lizard brain is sort of going out of fashion a bit, and we've moved on to the monkey brain more recently. The chimp paradox is one theory that talks about this explicitly, although as far as I can tell, Peters is pretty careful not to touch the discredited theories that claim the same thing. I don't think that would be very good for his sales. But the chimp brain and his formulation is posed against the human brain. So you have the emotional chimp brain versus the logical human brain, and the emotional chimp brain, he says, is more evolutionarily ancient, so we should sort of try and override this stupid chimp brain with our sensible human brain. A bit of poetic license there, but I think you get it. You can read his book if you want to learn more. And this overlaps anywhere that people are comparing our behaviour to chimps or bonobos or whatever close evolutionary relative with the same message. The idea that evolutionary development gave us this load of useless and maladaptive behaviours, and you would be better off setting these ape-like impulses in favour of the newer stuff built into your superior human brain. But of course, phylogeny isn't really this tidy, and there's no evidence that Polyvagal's branches correspond to evolutionary phases. And in fact, the earliest animals from which we descended had neocortices, these so-called new brain structures. And indeed, one of the most remarkable things about studying the brain is discovering just how capable even very small neural circuits are at producing extremely complicated behaviour. And I have an article that I think is interesting on my site that I'll link to about how honeybees, just little tiny honeybees, do abstract concept learning, which is stuff that we thought only humans could do for a really long time. And all of that with a brain that's smaller than a grain of rice. So again, we should ask, what is going on here? Why do we keep picking up this idea of these sort of shit evolutionary hangovers complicating our really high-speed A1 human brain bits? And I think that it is essentially the same thing as with fight or flight. There's this sort of distance from responsibility when we frame things like this. It's not you who are closed-minded or oversensitive, it's your lizard brain or your inner chimp. You're liberated from this aspect of yourself. There's also this interesting quality here as well. So you get this inventive evolutionary narrative that contradicts what we've been taught about ourselves, that makes for a really cool story that you can tell people, including yourself. And then I think there's this secret sort of bonus embedded here as well. So having studied cognitive ethology for a bit, which is the study of how non-human animals think, you see this theme crop up a lot. And that's that we like to think that humans are special, that we can do things that other things can't, that we can think in ways that they can't. And every time that we discover an animal can do what we do, can think how we think, just not as well or at the same scale, there's always about 20 years of flustered argument that comes out. So honeybees are an example of this that I studied. And again, I'll link that article. But there's actually this great journal called the Journal of Animal Sentience that demonstrates this pretty regularly. And I'll link to a very funny thread. Well, I think that it's funny with these academics arguing over whether fish can feel pain. And I think it's a good example of this. Maybe the best example. It's the closest that you'll ever get to academics writing in caps lock. And so I think that these theories, these evolutionary theories about ancient lizard brain or whatever, do the same thing for us because they make us feel special, right? They make us feel like we've evolved past these animalistic qualities holding us back, and we are maybe encouraged to feel powerful in doing something about them. But I think the problem is that all of these things have a very similar cost to the fight or flight theories, not so much in this case alienating people who have hypervigilant responses to day-to-day stimuli, but the idea that our evolutionary brain bits are probably something that we could work with, that work for us. You know, equating old with bad ignores all the times these systems have gracefully navigated the world for us. And so much of what we do occurs under the surface of our awareness. So the assumption that the newest and the least developed aspects of our nervous system are somehow better adapted to the world is pretty optimistic. That something battle-hardened over evolutionary time is going to be as helpful as something that cropped up in just the last little while. And you've probably actually seen examples of how silly this is, just superficially, even if it feels right when you're hearing these kinds of evolutionary theories. Because the same books and blogs and podcasts that demonize our evolutionary brain bits will also pretty regularly rail against this unfulfilling modern life, tell us how the modern world is making us sick, and wax all nostalgic about our healthier Paleolithic tendencies or whatever. And when you read this, you should sort of start to question to yourself, can we have it both ways? We're either well adapted to the modern world or we're not, or our past ways are helpful or they're not. And in this context, your evolutionary brain is probably doing just fine on average, right? Somewhere between the healthy past and the problematic present. So that's our second flavor. First, we had overcomplicating the stress response, and now we've got complaining about our useless evolutionary brain. And we're starting to see some similar trends come up. Why do these pop up and what's problematic about them? But before I sort of summarize that, there's one more flavor I want to talk about. And I think that this one is the most interesting. So let's get into that one. Now, when you step back, all these anti-old brain bits and anti-fight-or-flight tropes point at something a bit more general, which is using neuroscience to identify psychic enemies. This liberating idea that we can separate ourselves from these mental bad guys. And for a quick tangent, there's this class of psychological models that we could call something like parts work. So I will provide links to these, but examples include things like internal family systems or schema therapy or Gestalt therapy. And all of these are models that share the idea that within us, there are many different forces. And sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they get in the way. And so you're supposed to work with these internal parts, these mental parts, to achieve your goals. And you have to sort of tame the troublemakers, I guess. And modern pop science usage of brain bits is indistinguishable from this therapeutic kind of parts work. So the amygdala is a bad guy for hijacking your frontal lobes. It doesn't really matter that this isn't how the brain works. The role that these brain bits play is psychic enemy. The same with brain waves. I've been asked to review some professional development work for companies a few times now that speaks about this idea that beta brain waves are bad stressed states and that we perform much better in this more relaxed alpha wave state. And I might do a lecture about that at some point, actually, but I have written about it. I'll link to that. But the long and short of it is that brainwaves don't really function like this, but it puts a name to the psychic enemy. It's the beta brainwaves. Rather than talk about that in more detail, I want to talk about a fairly popular consumer version of this more official parts work therapy style called positive intelligence. What they do is they explicitly pair your psychological parts with brain bits. Brain bits, actually, that I've studied myself, so I find it particularly offensive, and that's why I guess I want to complain about them here. Now, their white paper that I'll link to singles out two well-studied neural networks, one of which is called the default mode network, which is a network of brain regions that are associated with, I guess you could say, more reflective thought, and a frontal parietal network, so a network at the front and the sides parietally of the brain that's associated with more task-oriented thought, I guess you could say. And what they do is they, again, in this white paper, although as far as I can tell nowhere else on their site, they recast these networks as saboteurs and as sages. And you could probably work out which ones of these are the bad guys and the good guys. So the saboteurs are something we should avoid and the sages are something that we should encourage. And that these networks bear very little relationship to the simplification that they outline in this white paper is clearly not relevant to the task at hand, which is naming the enemy. That's what they're doing. You have something to work against and something to work with. And there are other examples of basically the same thing. So The Complete Domination of the Business World by Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about System 1, which is the fast, naughty, emotional system of thinking, and System 2, the logical, slow, and sensible one. And then more recently, the chimp paradox, which is essentially the same thing but with mascots. All of these things put names to brain bits, naming the bad guys, the saboteurs, the System 1, the chimp brain. So again, we should ask, what's going on? Why does this kind of parts work keep cropping up, keep getting so popular? And hopefully it's obvious by now, but this is the most explicit form of the kind of self-liberation I've been talking about, distinguishing us from the mechanisms that cause us problems in how we think and behave. You see, most parts work spends time naming the parts, so call it a saboteur, or call it the amygdala, call it System 1, call it the chimp. The result is the same. You have isolated an aspect of yourself and you can now have a dialogue with it. You've created something that you can point at, something with a name and a shape. And frankly, and I talk about this elsewhere and I'll link to that, that's what we do with a lot of complex features of the world to make them more sensible or more legible to us, to help us more gracefully interact with things that are difficult to understand. And I suspect that this is the least troubling of the three trends. Making abstractions into entities seems pretty helpful to me. I mean, it is the most irritating for me personally, because one thing brain scientists love to do is talk about the brain, which is made very difficult when people think random psychological concepts are literal brain bits. You know, am I supposed to just sort of nod politely and wince through this kind of brain word salad because then we can have fun, right? Engaging with the often pretty interesting psychological stuff underneath. Or I could try and steer them into actual brain stuff with the risk that they're the ones nodding and wincing, or worse, glazing over. So these are tough questions that I'll have to answer, but all in all, the thing itself seems largely harmless, or maybe even beneficial. The only risk, I think, is overemphasizing these enemies. Spending a great deal of time calling out parts of your mind for messing up your day seems a bit rash. You know, these parts are usually doing some pretty important stuff for you that you're not really giving them credit for if you name them something like a saboteur. You know, and you wouldn't spend much time trying to restructure how your lungs work, because typically they're doing the job just fine on their own. So the same is probably true of whatever you're calling a saboteur. But by and large, this third flavour, you know, naming the bad bits, I think it seems pretty good to me, something worth encouraging as long as it's done right. So that's it, 3 flavours. And what I'll do now, since it's getting pretty late into the episode, is try and bring them all together. And from all this, try and give you a way that I would think about moving forward without necessarily abandoning these theories, just using them a bit more thoughtfully. And then I'll let you go. All right, so we've got 3 flavors of the same thing. You've got fight or flight theories. We've talked about the evolutionary brain bit theories, and we've got brain bits as enemy agents theories. And they all dress up pretty straightforward psychological phenomena in these complicated neuroscience clothes. And I think they do it for these 3 pretty predictable reasons. They create this distance from responsibility that I think is pretty useful. This idea that it's not you, it's your amygdala or whatever, and now you can work on it. And then they also tap into this interesting quality, right? Brain bits are usually sexier to talk about than just calming down. And you can talk about these things as a result, and people will listen rather than switching off. And then there's that sort of hidden one here that they make us feel more scientific and more special. I guess they sort of emphasize our humanity, which I think is important to us. And the alternative to these 3 things, you know, simply telling somebody to cool out, right? It gets the same message across, but it doesn't isolate the problem for people. It doesn't tell them how. It doesn't make us feel rational and special. And it makes us the problem rather than creating the distance we need to work on it. Not to mention that it's not particularly sexy. So I get all of that. I think the point of this lecture is just to sort of express that I wish we didn't keep picking shit ones, messages that confuse us or make things worse. Because here's the thing, you know, these convoluted narratives don't just describe our troubling behaviours, they also play a role in shaping how we think about ourselves. And when the narrative says that your emotions are enemies, that your stress response is an enemy, that your evolutionary inheritance is baggage, that, you know, that parts of your brain are saboteurs, then you're going to start treating yourself accordingly. And emotions aren't the bad guy. Stress is a useful biological tool, and your unconscious processes are doing an enormous amount of graceful work underneath your awareness all the time. The parts of you that these theories demonize are the parts that got you to where you are, and they might not always be convenient, but they're not malfunctioning. They're doing exactly what they were built to do. So rather than fight with these features of your system, I guess what I'm trying to do is call you to concentrate on how you can work with them, to celebrate them even, at least as often as you correct them. Don't just surrender to the comforting story of saboteurs in your brain. Do the work. Do the work to make them work for you. It doesn't require that much of you, just a little thoughtfulness. And I'll leave it there for today.